Well, let's go ahead and get started. So first, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar about Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers. This is the second of 6 webinars in our Wild and Scenic webinar series. My name is Angie Furman, and I'm the River Training Center Coordinator for River Management Society. Just a little bit about River Management Society. We're the nation's premier network connecting those who work on and for rivers with their river professional peers. So our members include river managers, outfitters and guides, rangers, planners and landscape architects, fluvial geomorphologists, environmental lawyers and policy makers, students, professors, researchers, authors, and more. So if you're not a member, I encourage you to visit our website at www.river-management.org to see the different benefits that are involved with the membership, including our biweekly news digest, our listserv, our quarterly journal, discounts, and more. And we have membership levels for anyone interested in rivers. So before we get started today, I'd like to let you all know that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available in a few days on the RMS video channel. To get to that, you can go to our website, and under professionals, you can see the second option down is our video training channel. In the video description, once we post the video, you'll also find a link to a PDF copy of today's slides. Also, today's materials track with the information found in Module 12 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers course of study, which is a free and self-directed learning resource that can be accessed on rivers.gov by going to the Resources tab and clicking on the Wild and Scenic River training modules. I've also provided a link to this on the resource handout for today's webinar. We're also excited to partner with American Trails today to offer learning credits to attendees for the webinar series. Learning credits are $15 per webinar and can be purchased at the American Trails online store before and after the webinar. So if you're interested in receiving these credits for distance learning, you must complete a quiz and fill out an evaluation survey for the webinar, which can be found as attachments under the Handouts tab. If you purchase learning credits or indicated interest on your registration form for today's webinar, you'll receive an email after with details. Lastly, we are excited to have 41 people today joining us. If you have any questions today during today's webinar, please ask them in the question and answer box. My colleague Risa Shimoda is joining me in the background and will be helping field questions. We'll be taking some breaks throughout the presentation to answer any questions, and we also have some time set aside at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to invite, you all to take a quick poll. We'd like to get a little bit of a understanding with how familiar you are with Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers. So I'm going to launch a poll here. And if you could just let us know how familiar you are, will give us a little bit more understanding of who's joining us today. Take about 5 more seconds here. All right, looks like most everyone has voted, so let's see. Looks like a lot of people have no idea what they are, or they've heard of them but don't know a lot. And we've got a little more than a quarter of you all that know quite a bit about them. So it looks like we've got a nice little spread today. So thanks for taking that poll. And now I'd like to invite our presenters for today to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Lord with the National Park Service, Natural Resources Specialist with the Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers program in the Northeast, and I'm based out of New Hampshire.
Hi, I'm glad you're here. I'm Shana Stewart Deeds. I was the study coordinator for the Upper Missisquoi and Trout Rivers Wild and Scenic Study in Vermont, and I'm currently a consulting partner working for the Park Service on materials for the Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers program.
Hi, I'm Fred Akers. I'm the river administrator for the Great Egg Harbor River Council and Watershed Association in New Jersey, a partnership Wild and Scenic River.
All right, thank you all for joining us.
I wanted to draw your attention to some resources that we have for you. If you look on the handouts tab in the GoToWebinar window, there's a handout that has all of these resources available to you and the links that you might want to go to explore more. If you go to the National Park Service nps.gov/PWSR webpage, all the links to all the partnership rivers are available on that webpage. So if you wanted to check the rivers out further, you could. And also, we've developed a Partnership Wild and Scenic River toolkit that has 3 sections. It's hosted on the RMS website, and the link is below. And it's set up so that there's an Explore tab. If you don't really know much about Wild and Scenic Rivers or Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers, you can start there and learn about the program. There's a Study tab where rivers that are under study, or if you're interested in knowing more about the study, you can go to that tab and learn more and see some examples of study materials and committees set up and things like that. And then the Designate tab is successes of what's happened since designation, a place where partnership rivers can find out more about what other rivers are doing as well. And then we also have the newsletters. The partnership program has had newsletters every couple of years for maybe 20 or so years, and they're set up on the PWSR toolkit. You can find back issues of the partnership news, and then the current issue is a year-long series where we're highlighting the rivers in the months that they're designated. So you can find the links to all of those on the toolkit page as well.
Great, so as everyone knows, we'll be talking about Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers today. So in the webinar, we'll be covering the history and evolution of the partnership approach, the National Park Service's Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers model, partnership river principles, the roles of the Wild and Scenic River agencies, state and local partners, and nonprofit organizations, benefits of Partnership Wild and Scenic River designation, future of designations, and some additional resources that Shana just gave you a little teaser of. So some objectives for today's webinar. We'd like to increase your knowledge about wild and scenic rivers that flow primarily or entirely through non-federal, privately owned land, to build skills for partnering with local communities and other stakeholders to better protect and enhance wild and scenic river values, to increase local stakeholder participation in developing and implementing voluntary strategies to address potential threats to wild and scenic values, to increase the use of partnerships and cooperative agreements to implement comprehensive river management plans and to protect and enhance wild and scenic rivers, and finally to support stakeholder discussions about the designation of additional wild and scenic river segments on non-federal lands, including areas outside of the Northeast. So some of you may have attended the first webinar last month, which was kind of a Wild and Scenic Rivers 101. So this may be a little repetitive, but today we'll be talking about Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers, which is a subset of the National Wild and Scenic Rivers System, which was created on October 2nd, 1968 through the passage of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And here is a little passage from the Act. It is hereby declared to be the policy of the United States that certain selected rivers of the nation, which with their immediate environments possess outstandingly remarkable scenic, recreational, geologic, fish and wildlife, historic, cultural, or other similar values shall be preserved in free-flowing condition, and that they and their immediate environment shall be protected for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. So that's kind of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and system in a nutshell. So we're going to dig a little bit into the history of partnership rivers. So as I said, 1968, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was enacted, creating the system. And most of the early designations into the system were rivers that flow primarily through public lands in the western United States. And none of the original 8 rivers designated into the system were located in the private lands dominated Northeast. This isn't surprising given the private property rights advocacy and inclusion in Section 6 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which covers federal land acquisition to fulfill congressional intent. And it wasn't until the 1970s that Congress designated any rivers east of Wisconsin. And even these designated rivers, such as the Chattooga, Obed, and Middle Delaware, flowed primarily through state or federally owned lands, not through private lands. The addition in 1978 of the Upper Delaware River into the national system marked the first time that a congressionally designated, federally administered river, flowing mostly through private lands, came with a stringent land acquisition cap. It was also the first instance where the enabling legislation explicitly prescribed local zoning protection rather than federal land acquisition as a primary protective strategy. For the first time, the federal and local governments in 2 states formally worked together to develop land use protections. And for the Upper Delaware, Congress directed the National Park Service to develop land and water use guidelines and a management plan for the Upper Delaware River in coordination with the states of New York and Pennsylvania, the Delaware River Basin Commission, and the local communities which organized into a management council. However, unlike subsequent partnership designations in the number of years since, the cooperative management plan for the Upper Delaware was not prepared during the Wild and Scenic study process. It followed the extensive taking of private lands by federal condemnation for the proposed Army Corps of Engineers flood control / water supply dam at Tox Island. So almost a decade later after the Upper Delaware was designated, the designation of the Wildcat River in New Hampshire was unique because it was the first time a river management plan was written prior to the designation of the river into the national system, and because it only allowed acquisition of privately owned riverfront lands outside of the White Mountain National Forest through donation or with consent of the landowner. There's no federal condemnation of lands. Like the Upper Delaware River, an advisory council comprised of local representatives was established to guide management and local land use decisions outside the boundaries of the national forest. So in 1992, the Great Egg Harbor River in New Jersey was the first Wild and Scenic River designated under our current partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers model. Along with the Wild and Scenic designation, the river was also designated as a National Park Service unit, and it's the only partnership river with that designation. Subsequent partnership river designations steered away from that Park Service unit model. Statutory basis for the partnership Wild and Scenic model comes from Section 7 of the Section 11, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was amended in October of 1986 to expand the cooperative authorities of federal agencies with state, local, and private entities in the planning, protection, and management of river resources. So Section 11B1 authorizes the Secretary of the Interior, Secretary of Agriculture, or the head of any other federal agency to provide assistance and cooperate with states or other entities and individuals to plan, protect, and manage river resources. This authority applies to federal and non-federal lands and is not limited to components of the National Wild and Scenic River System. It applies to all rivers in the country. Such cooperation typically occurs through a written agreement that provides for financial or other assistance from the Departments of Agriculture or Interior. So we've been talking about partnership wild and scenic rivers, and I wanted to give a little comparison between the traditional wild and scenic rivers and the partnership approach. So you see in this graphic, traditional wild and scenic rivers are managed by the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And they're managed through these federal agencies as park units, forests, wildlife refuges, and other federal lands. And in the partnership approach, we have locally led partnerships helped by federal support. The local land use laws and private property rights are maintained. And again, there's no federal acquisition of land. And there are a couple links on the bottom of this slide. The link on the left is to a U.S. Forest Service video about wild and scenic rivers. And the link on the right is a partnership wild and scenic rivers video. So we have another poll for you guys.
Yep, all right. So I'm going to launch our second poll here. Of all the wild and scenic rivers, how many are partnership wild and scenic rivers? Give it a couple more seconds here. The last few votes come in. All right, and let's see the results. Looks like about 72% of you said less than 10%. And that is the correct answer.
I'll get our tech now. There we go. So as you correctly guessed, or maybe you knew, of the wild and scenic rivers of the rivers in the United States, less than 1% have been designated as wild and scenic rivers. And of those, less than 10% are partnership rivers. So 16 out of over 220 designated rivers are partnership rivers. And you might be joining our webinar today to think about whether or not the partnership model or wild and scenic designation in general is a good fit for your river or your community. And these are some of the questions you can consider when you're thinking about that. Is there a history of local involvement and commitment to your river, and can you demonstrate that in some way? Maybe there's a very active watershed association. Maybe you have excellent community rules and regulations around your rivers for protection. Maybe you have active involvement in protection or setting up management of your rivers. Is there a mix of land ownership? So traditional wild and scenic designation works really well on federally owned lands or predominantly federally owned lands, because then the federal agency can manage those rivers. But if you have a mix of ownership, like especially if you have private land ownership predominantly, or a mixture of private and state and federal lands around your river, the partnership model is a nice model for managing those types of rivers. Also, in order to be designated, you have to have at least one significant and high value river value at the, you have it at the local level, but it needs to be significant at a regional or national level. And also, if you're looking for wild and scenic designation for your river, it's not a short-term process, it's a longer-term process. So having good local and agency partners to work with is crucial. We need to have our volunteers who are looking for designation for their river able to sustain a 3-year study, and then maybe it's a decade from when you start thinking about this to when you're actually designated. Maybe it's less, maybe it's more, but you want to have good partners in that process with you. Also, do you have congressional representatives that would be receptive to introducing legislation on behalf of your river for a study or designation? And then finally, is your river listed on the nationwide rivers inventory? So you don't have to be listed on there in order to be designated, but if your river is listed on there, then some of the legwork has already been done for you because your river has been found eligible for designation because of its free-flowing character and because it has been identified to have at least one outstanding value that's significant. So the partnership river principles include, as Emma said, no additional federal land ownership resulting from designation. So partnership rivers don't become part of federal land ownership or management or units of the Park Service. Also, the land use and the management of your river is really based at a local level. You have a local river council that helps govern and manage your river, and existing state and local laws that were in existence before designation or the study occurred continue to be what is governing your river and river management. During the study process, as Emma stated, there is a locally developed comprehensive river management plan that's approved before designation and guides the future management of your river, and that can be used regardless of whether you actually become a designated river. So a benefit of completing a Wild and Scenic River study is that you have support in order to write and develop your comprehensive river management plan. And the management's shared among your local, state, and federal stakeholders, and also creates a partnership of organizations and people that are really working toward management and improvements of your river. It also is a voluntary program, so no one is being forced into participating in this program, and there are some important, in your legislation, it's important that your communities in which designation would occur show support for designation before designation would occur in your river, so it's completely voluntary. But it also provides federal assistance and funding to implement your river management plan, along with providing technical assistance from the federal agency that you work with in order to complete your designation. Oops. The partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers study might be the answer if you want local control over your river management, but you would like federal recognition and designation of your river. And it's also a model that was developed and worked really well in the East when other efforts failed. Being from the East myself, I can say that I have worked with people, and people in my family are sometimes reticent to federal involvement in management of their resources. And the partnership program is locally driven with federal support. So that model was really important in designation of any rivers in the East where there might be some hope for continued local management over resources and a lot of thoughtfulness about private property rights. The rivers that are designated under the partnership model, here's a list, and Fred, who works with the Great Egg Harbor Partnership Wild and Scenic River, can talk to you a little more about their designation, but they were the first, as Emma said. And then our most recent designated rivers were in 2019 and include rivers in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. We have one river under study. The York River is still under study in Maine. I believe their legislation, if it hasn't been already sent to Congress, will soon be sent for seeking designation of the York River in Maine, but they're our study river currently. And I encourage you to go to the nps.gov website and the Partnership River website and look at these different rivers and see if their study and their designation and the way that they operate is seeming like it might be a good fit for your river if you're interested in the partnership model of designation. Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers are really a cooperative approach of community protection for the river. And because they're almost entirely through privately owned non-federal lands, the partnership approach combines community stewardship and protection while also allowing there to be federal technical and financial support for the river. It also, through Section 7 of the Act, allows the local community to weigh in on any federal water management projects that may occur on your river, which allows, again, more local input into anything that might be going on along your river. Most partnership rivers are designated after a congressionally authorized study that finds the river suitable and eligible for designation. So in order to become designated as any wild and scenic river or a partnership wild and scenic river, you need to have legislation that goes through the US Congress and is passed and signed into law. So if you would like a wild and scenic river study, you need to be authorized for the study. And typically that involves a local watershed organization or a nonprofit that seeks to lead the study and bring people together in order to coordinate the study effort. And that group needs to work with congressional officials to introduce an amendment to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act to authorize a study. That law then needs to be moved through Congress and be passed by Congress and then signed into law by the president in order to enact a study on your river. And the study is not only are you being authorized to study, but it allows some federal funds to support the organization through the approximately 3-year study process. If you've been authorized for a wild and scenic study, then you set up a study committee in order to work through the study and create your river management plan. The way that your committee is set up has several different models. And what I like about the partnership approach is that it's not a one-size-fits-all process. Your community really gets to decide how your committee is set up. That's usually written into your study legislation. And some rivers have chosen to be a more formally legislated committee, which is set up through the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And if you're a study committee that follows the FACA rules, then you have some more constraints on how your committee can operate. But the Wekiva River in Florida decided to utilize that model of setting up their committee. If you would like a more informal model, if that would fit your community better, then there are a couple other options. Some informal models are formed by the National Park Service and have Park Service staff as part of their study process. The Farmington River in Connecticut is one such example. The river that I worked on in Vermont had the third option, and I think that's a more common option currently for the Partnership Study Committee model, which is an informal committee that is formed by the local study sponsor. So in our case, the Watershed organization in our community moved forward with getting the legislation passed for a study, and they helped set up the study committee, which was made up of representatives from the 10 towns in the study area. So it's really up to your community, what's going to work for your community and how river management might make, or how setting up your committee might make the most sense in your community. And during the study, you need to think about whether your river is eligible for wild and scenic designation, which includes identifying sections of your river which are free flowing. If you have dams on your river, that doesn't mean your river cannot be designated. But because the act was set up to combat some widespread dam building in the 60s, one of the requirements of the main stretches of your river that are designated is that they must be free flowing. So sometimes, like on our river in Vermont, we ended our designation at a major dam in order to still meet the eligibility requirements of a free flowing river, or sometimes people cut out a dammed section of the river and the area of the river that's impacted by the dam in order to designate their river section. So having dams doesn't kill your ability to have wild and scenic designation, but after your river is designated, there can't be any federally permitted dams that occur on your river later. The other piece of being eligible is having at least one outstandingly remarkable value. Those values, as Emma read in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, tend to fall under the categories that were listed in the Act, which include recreational value. Maybe you have amazing swimming holes or a really important paddling trail for recreation on your river. Scenic, which can include vistas or tourist attractions where the scenic character of your river is really important. They can be cultural resources, such as important Native American sites. On the Missisquoi, we have the covered bridges, so that a town with the highest concentration of covered bridges in the United States, which is a cultural, outstandingly remarkable value. Maybe your values are geologic, maybe they're natural history and fish and wildlife related, like rare, threatened, and endangered species, or really important water quality. Our river also had the highest undammed falls in the state. So those were the two major ORVs that once we found those, we knew, okay, we have at least one resource that's regionally or nationally significant, and then we can really dig into writing the management plan about all the amazing resources of our river. And a key quality of the study is that it's a dry run for designation. So it allows community members to see what it would be like to have a designated river in their community. Community members also get to help research the rivers and draft the management plan. There's a lot of combating of misinformation. People just don't understand what designation means. And so that's a big part of your role during the study. But it's important to know that the towns remain the legislation and regulations that existed before designation continue to remain the primary drivers of management of your river even after designation, and that the Park Service is a resource during the study, but the towns and whoever your committee decides to have be voting members of your committee, they're the ones that are making the decisions for what happens with the management plan and also with whether or not to move forward with designation. If your river is found to be eligible and your committee decides that wild and scenic designation is really what they want to move forward with, then you need to demonstrate suitability of your river for designation, which includes having support from your municipalities and your state. So in our committee, we demonstrated suitability by showing what protections exist within our community with regulations and zoning and ordinances, but we also collected letters of support from groups within our community, businesses within our community, the governor, our local municipalities, nonprofits in our community. But the final vote for whether or not we would move forward with designation and ask our representatives to put forth legislation for designation and demonstrating suitability came through a ballot question. This is an example of the ballot question that we used. And we took our ballot question to the town meeting in each of the towns that we were seeking designation in. And the Park Service traditionally has not moved forward with designation unless there's support from all the communities that are involved. And so in our town, we went to each town's town meeting, but in other communities, there may be a different way that you show your municipality shows support, but it's however your municipalities are governed, that's how you would show support for designation. So because the towns voted yes to move forward with designation, then we requested that our congressional representatives support designation by introducing legislation, and then that legislation would again need to move through Congress, be passed through Congress, and then get signed into law by the president to amend the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act to include our river for designation. Also, just because the partnership rivers that exist now are under the Park Service and in the East, there's no reason why that model can't be expanded throughout the country. So there can be eligible rivers throughout the country that are eligible for Wild and Scenic Rivers designation. And perhaps just there are other federal agencies that could and would want to be the federal agency that's overseeing designation or partnership designation of other rivers. So just because the model so far has been in the East with the Park Service doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. And in fact, Fred's going to talk a little bit more about expanding partnership Wild and Scenic River designation coming up. So we wanted to take a brief moment to pause and see if folks have any questions. Emma and I have thrown a lot of information at you so far, and we wanted to take a minute to see if anyone has any questions for any of us. And again, you'll have another opportunity to ask questions at the end, but we wanted to check in now and see if folks have questions.
We do have a question from John White. If we are already a designated wild and scenic river, can we switch to the partnership model?
That's a great question. Speaking from historical perspective, that hasn't happened in the past yet. But I don't see a reason why that possibly couldn't happen. I think the designating legislation provides language that might kind of hinder that transition from a traditional wild and scenic to a partnership. So that might be a big sticking point, that the language in the designation legislation might kind of prohibit that. But that's a great question, and I personally have never thought of that before. But
Yeah, let me make a comment to that. I think the suitability function of the designation would kind of tell the difference. So if your river's already designated, it's eligible because it's designated, but would it be suitable to be managed locally under the suitability metrics that Shana talked about?
So look at suitability, look at the enabling legislation. Ooh, that was a tough one. Next question from Lynn Crum. Where did you say the partnership wild and scenic river is being studied? I think you said the York. Where is that?
The York River in southern Maine is the current partnership river under study.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Kestrel Kuhn says, sorry if you already said this, but do partnership wild and scenic rivers usually come with a federal water right?
no, I would say.
Again, since we don't have western rivers and water rights are very differently managed in the west than the east, there hasn't really been a precedent for that. I think that it would need to be part of the river management and the study to establish and if there were any changes with water rights. But I imagine that there wouldn't be under this model, but it hasn't been done, so.
Okay, and one more. Can you go back to the slide on section 11B1 where you said there were collaborative authorities for any river, not just wild and scenic rivers?
And for those of you familiar with the National Park Service's Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program, that actually kind of stems from this section of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So that program provides assistance for rivers, trails, and conservation projects, and those don't need to be on designated rivers. That can be on any location in the country.
Okay, let's see. Does NPS play a leadership role on a study committee, or is it more detached?
I mean, I think Shana and Fred could probably speak to their experiences on their rivers. I think that's something that's very river dependent. Some of the rivers have very strong local advocates and even use some of the federal financial assistance to hire a local study coordinator, as was the case on the Missisquoi with Shana. But it's very river dependent. So sometimes Park Service plays a major role as a study coordinator, and other times it's a local coordinator. But Shana and Fred could speak more to that.
I think that pretty much sums it up. The Park Service is, they're kind of the glue that keeps everything together, and they are like going out to the public through the whole process. So, but it depends on the time and the place.
I would say that the Park Service staff that I work with are never heavy-handed. They take a backseat role in the study and designation because it's really locally driven. And so they're there to provide answers to questions that you have or assistance with drafting legislation or information and technical assistance about how to write a management plan, but how you set up your committee and how you run your study and what your committee decides for designation is all locally driven, and the Park Service is a resource. They don't have voting authority on the committee. For the committee that I was involved in, the voting authority was from the select board appointees to the study committee from each of the towns and the partners that were involved. And the Park Service was a member of the committee, but not a voting member. And other agencies could also take that role in other areas if it made sense for the partnership model to be sought after, not under the Park Service. It's just that they've traditionally been under the Park Service so far.
Okay, that's all the questions for now so far.
Thank you.
Great, thanks.
All right, up next, we've got another poll here. And this one is a little bit more of a knowledge check because we've touched on this. But does the ownership of land change after a partnership Wild and Scenic River is designated? We'll give a couple more seconds here. All right, so looks like everyone has gotten their votes in, so we'll go ahead and close the poll. And here are the results. So we had 96% of you saying no. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fred here.
Okay, so there's get rid of that. There's various roles that different partners and agencies play in a partnership Wild and Scenic River. So there's already been a lot of talk about the federal agency role in the terms of technical assistance and financial assistance and conducting something called a Section 7 review, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'll give you an example of where the Park Service assisted in the study. There was an interest on my river, there was an interest of 12 towns to participate, but they didn't want to be told what to do. So the National Park Service hired a consultant to create local zoning best management practices and provided that guidance to the towns, and then the towns created their own local river management plans. So that's an example of the federal role in the study. And then the towns that wanted to participate did so, and we had the same process of having resolutions of support. So once the designation occurs, then the towns typically would populate a council. So they would have members of the town be appointed to the council. And then our council functions primarily as a forum where river issues are continually worked on. And one of the things I think is striking with the partnership program and local participation is that once it's set, the plan is set, it's forever. So one of the challenges for nonprofits and other partners that are not necessarily municipal partners is to keep it going because the towns change elected officials quite often, and they have to be re-educated on what it's all about and what happened and why it was occurred and what the outstanding resource values to be protected are. The nonprofits play a key role, especially in the funding part of it, because for federal funding to be passed through in form of cooperative agreements, there has to be an organization that can receive that funding. So nonprofits that have a 501c3 designation can do that, and then they also have, their goals and missions for protection that they bring to bear. The comprehensive management plans are generated during the study process. And so the question that this is getting at here, so what happens if you get Congress to designate a study, and the study happens, and for some reason the river doesn't get designated? So if you get through that and there's a formal study that's done, then that study can be used as a management tool by any agencies in the state or counties or towns that want to pick up the protection mantle. Then once your river is designated, you have recognition, prestige, protection, and some economics, which I'll talk about next here. So one of the benefits is a required federal development review under Section 7. And the way I like to tell people about this is that if you need to look at wild and scenic river protection in the basic sense as a no trespassing sign for federal development or federally assisted development. So what I mean there is, if a river's a wild and scenic river, then the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or the Army Corps or other federal development agencies would see that, and maybe they would say, oh, well, that's a wild and scenic river, we'll look someplace else for our development projects. Or they would go to the managing agency like the National Park Service and say, well, we want to build a dam on your river in the wild and scenic section. What do you think of that? And it would give the managing agencies a chance to say, what are you kidding me? You can't do that. And going back in time for the existing partnership rivers, some of them were motivated to get wild and scenic river protection because of federal development projects that were proposed on their river that they didn't like. I know of a case where there was a federal toxic waste disposal site that was being proposed on the banks of the Morris River, and that inspired a lot of local people to say, hey, we don't want that, and if we defeat that now, how can we prevent that from happening in the future? So that's under Section 7A of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, that work is done by the Park Service or the managing agency. So there's also technical and financial assistance to implement river management projects. So on my river, in the designation language, it stated simply that the river will be managed by the Secretary of Interior through cooperative agreements with local jurisdictions. So that meant that the Department of Interior would be providing money through cooperative agreements to local jurisdictions to implement the management plan and long-term protection. So the word leveraging comes up a lot with partnership wild and scenic rivers. So you have all these partners and all these different interests that a lot of them want to do things, and they can bring money to the table to do things on your river. So there's a lot of different leveraging things that go on. One example was on the Great Egg, the state of New Jersey. Once the Wild and Scenic designation occurred, they identified the Great Egg Harbor River as a focus area for land preservation. And they began to purchase land for open space with state funding. So millions and millions of dollars have been leveraged for that purpose through the other partnership rivers in other states. There's leverage that doesn't usually get accounted for, which I'm like pretty sensitive to and interested in. So like if you have a unit of the national park system, in the budget for that unit would be, if it has roads on it, they have to be kept up. If there's search and rescue, you have to have equipment for that, fire control. So those things are budget line items in national parks and other units, but in the Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers program, all those functions are conducted by local towns, counties, and the state. So the Section 7 review is, I mentioned that's where the federally assisted water research projects are reviewed by Wild and Scenic River agencies to make sure they're not going to be detrimental. And in my river, on the Great Egg, there's many reviews of federally assisted water resource projects that occur every year, and rarely are they denied. So what happens is, like, for example, a county has roads that they have to, upgrade, or bridges that they have to upgrade over time that are going over Wild and Scenic River segments. So when they apply for rebuilding of those bridges, which they're required to do, the managing agencies can ask for things, conditions of development, like, is it possible for that bridge to be a free span and not have any, pilings or supports in the water that would affect the flow? So that's an example for there. Let's see, locally appointed river council guides future management across jurisdictions. And again, it's forever. So it's a connection between the towns and the state and the counties and the National Park Service to really keep an eye on protection with that in mind all the time. Come on here. All right, so what are some of the other benefits, which there are a lot that you might not think of. So for public access, just imagine you have a river system with 12 municipalities and 4 counties all separately planning for public access for the benefit of their citizens. So that occurs up and down these rivers all over, and there's investments of time and effort to like provide access for a lot of different parties and themes. You can have concerted efforts for dam removal. It's a wild and scenic river. It's supposed to be free flowing. So if there's any old dams that are obsolete, they could be removed. I think one of the universal programs that all the Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers do a lot of is educating youth. So education and outreach and youth engagement are kind of the buzzwords. And I think all of us Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers are really big on that. There's celebrations that occur. Wildlife protection is another theme that gets a lot of play. We, on the Great Egg, we monitor osprey nests. We have a colony of 50 nests that we manage and monitor. And then, as I mentioned before, land preservation is probably one of the ultimate ways to protect land on a wild and scenic river. And that preservation is done by states and counties and municipalities, not by federal agencies. Expanding the model. So the partnership program has been growing in leaps and bounds out here on the East Coast. So you were shown that there were 3 new rivers that came on all at once in 2019. The York River in Maine is getting pretty close. And there's a new river down in Florida, the Kissimmee River, that has legislation pending for a study. But all of these rivers are out on the East Coast. So there's an opportunity to take this model for other rivers in other states. And let me go mention about the nationwide rivers inventory, because that was brought up before. And there's over 3,000 river segments in the country that have been identified as rivers with outstanding resource values that have the potential to be protected under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And of those 3,000 rivers, most of them are on private lands. So if you want to protect those rivers under a Wild and Scenic designation, the Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers program is a proven model for doing that. So that's my pitch for that. And so here's a wrap-up slide, and I'm going to turn it back to Angie at this point to close up and go into questions.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, so now we have some time for some more questions and discussion. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put those into the question box. And while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I do want to mention that next month in March, we're going to be having another webinar in the series, and it will be covering an introduction to Section 7 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So Fred talked a little bit about Section 7. If you're interested in learning more, join us March 17th, same time, and we'll be diving deeper into that topic.
So we do have a question. How are the private landowners held accountable for maintaining ORVs? It's a good one.
That is a great question. And I think this is where that local engagement and local stewardship really takes in. I think typically, unless it's a really egregious situation where the ORVs are being degraded, I think typically the Park Service or the federal agency doesn't step in. It's more the local Watershed Association or local NGOs or towns, and really the representatives on the local stewardship councils are the ones really with the boots on the ground identifying these problem areas and working to kind of remedy them. I don't know if that's what you've experienced on the Great Egg Harbor, Fred?
Yeah, one of the principal protections is local zoning, which is kind of established and identified in the management plan. So every town has zoning ordinances, and if people follow those, there's usually no problem. If they don't follow those, then the zoning officer can talk with them about that. So we don't see that as too much of a problem, but you know, this is a long-term program, like forever. And we're recently finding an issue that we're beginning to address. And that is that you have riverfront residents that live on a tidal portion of the river, and sea level is rising, and we're having flood events, and people's property are floating away and becoming marine debris in the marsh areas. So we're starting a new program where we're identifying this issue And then we're going to be reaching out to riverfront residents with formal communications to, bring this up to them, that this is something that we're seeing happening. So if you have possessions on your property you don't want to float away, if there's a flooding event, secure them. And geez, if something floats away that you didn't want to float away, you could contact us and we'll maybe help you find it and bring it back. So those are, ways to do it, but it takes, you have to work at it, and it takes your partners to do those things.
Thanks. That was a question from John White. Thanks, John. This is from Robin Thompson. Is there a minimum length for a wild and scenic river?
No, there is not. I think one of the longer partnership designations is actually the Great Egg Harbor, I think 129 miles, Fred?
Yeah, and the White Clay Creek is even bigger because it was done on a watershed basis with smaller streams.
I think,
I think that if you want to have your river studied, then there would be some preliminary thinking done about that. So you would contact your member of Congress to see if they would be interested in supporting that, and then they would ask the Park Service to take a preliminary look to see if it would be feasible to do a study based on like what's there and the values and the stream lengths and whether it's actually free flowing enough or not. So there would be some preliminary judgment done before the study would be officially started.
and just to put the mileage in a little context, I think the national system as a whole, the shortest designation is the River Styx in Oregon, I believe, which is less than a mile in length. And I think for the partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers, the shortest is about 15 miles. So as Fred said, it's really about the free flow and eligibility questions, not so much the length.
Yeah, one follow-up comment is if you look at the nationwide rivers inventory, 3,000 list, there's a lot of really short segments that are on there, 5 miles, 4 miles, 9 miles. And I'm like a watershed guy. I'm Watershed Fred. So what can happen is if you have a segment, it's in a watershed, and if that short segment has value, there's really a good potential that if a study were to occur, there would be other segments that would be connected to that would have value and could possibly be included in a designation.
Thanks. Here's another question from Jack, who was probably thinking about his little river called the Little River in Alabama. Have you seen problems crop up post-designation with the locally appointed river council having disagreements on how to manage the river?
That's another great question. I don't think, to my knowledge, there have been any major kind of disagreements. I think the river management plan that was developed during the study process is really the guiding document to any management decisions. So I think the councils typically rely heavily on what the management plan says when making decisions about how to manage the rivers. But I don't know, Fred, have you had experiences with your council in any disagreements?
No, not really, but they could occur, and you have like we have 12 towns, and there could be competing interests in the towns, but it seems that most people are there because they care about the river, and I would say that the conflicts I've seen revolve more around how best to spend federal money to protect the river. So people can agree largely on that, okay, we need to raise money we need fundraise, we need to have money. But then when it comes time to deciding how you want to spend it, there's not always a strong agreement there, and then you have to work at it. So it's almost harder to spend money on a consensus basis. And we have some votes, and there's some winners and losers sometimes, but that's how it goes.
Well, if other people would like to ask a question, we still have plenty of time left.
I'll just put in a plug for the some of the resources that we shared. I think particularly the partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers video. It's about 15 minutes long, and there's a lot of great interviews and insights from both Park Service as well as local organizations and local river advocates from several of the partnership rivers. So that's a great resource to give you a little bit more information and provide some great visuals.
Yeah, I'll make another comment here. I've been working on this partnership river for about 20 years. And since we were the first one, I was around when additional ones were designated. And it wasn't, there wasn't a vision that this would become a program of significant size in the beginning. So when we got to be about 4 or 5 rivers, the National Park Service began to get concerned that the rivers Congress was designating the rivers, but they weren't providing funding to operate them. And they kind of came to the non-governmental organization partners and said, it might not be a bad idea if you go to Congress and make sure that they provide adequate funding to manage these rivers once they're designated. And after 28 years or however long it's been, and 16 rivers, it's now a program. It's a big program, and the NGOs work together to ensure that the funding for the program is, quote, robust.
So Lynn asked, are the links in the handouts, or could it be in the chat box? Maybe we could go through what's in that third handout.
Yeah. I can add it to our screen here.
Because there were a number of URLs mentioned during the presentation on the slides.
All right, so I'm sharing my screen here with the handout. You can reach that under the handout tab. It's titled Partnerships Webinar Resources and Contact Info. And here we've got several resources. Fred, I don't know if you want to mention the first one, the article, since your name's next to it.
Yeah, that's kind of an old one that I worked with Jamie Fosberg and Joe DeBello. I think it was the 40th anniversary of Wild and Scenic Rivers, and we pitched that in the George Wright Society organization. And we did spend a lot of time trying to craft almost like a white paper of how the program developed and where it was at. I'd also like to really pitch the partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers toolkit that Shana put together. She worked on that for quite a long time, and it's very comprehensive. It's a huge resource, and it comes at you can come at it from all the directions that you need to. Like, there's separate sections on, okay, how do you recruit a member of Congress to be interested in a study and a designation? So how does that happen? How do you do that? So that's a key resource that anybody who's interested needs to be able to know about and use.
So here's a question. Do you know, you might want to keep that up, Angie, but do you know how large the funding is for the Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers?
I do. I'm quite familiar with that because we fight for it all the time. So there's 16 rivers, and for this fiscal year, FY21, the total appropriation is $3.925 million for 16 rivers, and then there's a Washington office that supports the program, and that prorates to about $241,000 per river currently, and then that $241,000 is divided between the National Park Service, for their staff and costs, and then for the local river managers, as part of the cooperative agreements. So one of the things to think about there is, so there's a unit, in a sense, of the National Park System or the National Wild and Scenic Rivers System that's being funded at a level of $240,000. And if you compare that with the Upper Delaware and the Middle Delaware, which are kind of semi-partnership, the Upper Delaware is kind of a semi-partnership that's federally managed. They're getting $4 million for about 125 miles for one system. So the partnership model is really cost effective.
Great. So Danielle, hopefully it has gone to everyone. There's a new paper out about Partnership Wild and Scenic Rivers and how they can be used for river restoration and water quality. I'm not sure if everyone has seen that. And then another one specific about water quality. So if you don't see that, if you could send a question in, because I'm not sure that went to everyone. And then Bud asks, for parks within the National Park Service, I'm not sure if this is a question or not. For parks within the NPS system, there is natural resources plan for outstanding features that also lists the threats to those resources. How does Wild and Scenic River protection work with example, dogs have died from drinking river water in the past decade because of toxic algae, or swimming hold, swimmer's itch, toxic hair from snails, or plastic, which Fred just mentioned. The EU suggests that 80% of the plastic in the ocean is from terrestrial sources, also carried through rivers and flooding. Also, it said that by 2030, there may be more plastic bottles in the ocean than fish, thanks to loads carried by rivers. So I think it's dealing with how does the designation deal with water pollution.
Right.
Yeah.
I can take a crack at that. The states are the main entity that deals with water quality under the Clean Water Act. Some states have the authority kind of designated to them by EPA, and maybe EPA is the key entity in other states. I just know New Jersey measures water quality constantly, and they report to the EPA under the Clean Water Act what segments or reporting units don't meet the designated use. So that's like kind of a basic one. But then there's current things that are going on, like in New Jersey, there's been problems with toxic algae blooms in lakes, and the state is heavily invested in that. And then local managers, whether it's within a wild and scenic river or not, get involved with issues like that. So I think that if you're a wild and scenic river, you can kind of point to that, and maybe in the competitive scheme of things, you might have a leg up to get some attention to your river because it's designated. You want to say something, Emmy? You have a thought?
Yeah, I would, that's a great summary, and I would just add that many of the partnership rivers use some of the federal funding to help do water quality monitoring, whether it's with their local watershed association or other groups. And at least on a couple of the councils that I work with, there's been a lot of talk about emerging contaminants, whether it's PFAS or plastics. And there's been a lot of talk of using some of that federal funding to help support some studies on some of those emerging contaminants and other issues with water quality. So that's another situation where the federal funding can really do a lot on that local level.
Yeah, another example is that the National Park Service has been working on a mercury evaluation in some of the rivers. So the Morris River, they worked in partnership with the local folks on the Morris River to collect dragonfly macroinvertebrates that were sent out to be analyzed for mercury content. I think the Wakaiba down in Florida is going to be next for that. So there's an example where there's a specific constituent of pollution that's being looked at closely in certain places as examples to try to, I guess, assess the extent of it and then maybe what can be done to mitigate it.
Also, there's a section, I think it's 11B, where the agencies are asked to manage different qualities of the river. I'm not going to say this right, Fred, but for instance, on the lower Delaware, because through the process of designation or when consideration was being given, a Delaware Basin River Authority was kind of became in charge of water quality. So one of the reasons for designation was the river quality was so awful, decades and decades ago. Because of the Delaware River Basin Authority, it is now, drinkable and swimmable. So elements of the act can be used to actually improve, not simply not degrade your water quality. Does that sound correct? Fred, you know better than I.
Yes, no, that's correct. And one of the things that I recently learned, and since the 50th anniversary celebration for Wild and Scenic Rivers, there's a new national coalition for Wild and Scenic Rivers. So it's an advocacy group that's populated by American Rivers and American Whitewater and River Network. And they brought this point out that I hadn't thought about, was that the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was passed in 1968. And that was before the Clean Water Act was passed. So in their advocacy and their thinking that there needs to be more work done now to enhance that connection between Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and the Clean Water Act, so that there's more power in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act to get better water quality for Wild and Scenic Rivers. Let me say something else to the restoration comment, the restoration question. The Kissimmee River in Florida has the biggest river restoration project in the world, I think. And they're proposing to study it for wild and scenic designation. And if that is successful, it will kind of be proof that if a river is damaged and then it's restored, it has wild and scenic values that are worth designating.
Wow, thank you for that.
Well, oh, go ahead, Rita.
No, go ahead, Angie. No, I was just going to hand it back to you.
Yeah, doesn't look like there's any other questions right now, but if you do think of any questions after the webinar and you'd like to get those answered, as you can see here on the resources and contact info handout, we have the email addresses of all of today's presenters. So feel free to reach out to them with any other follow-up questions. And again, just another reminder, we have the next webinar in the series coming up on March 17th, Introduction to Section 7 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And then because this is such a important topic, and yet sometimes complicated topic, we are going to be covering it over 2 webinars. We'll start in March and then we'll be finishing it in April. April will be Section 7 and a broader NEPA analysis. So both webinars will be looking at Section 7. Also, before we end today, I did want to highlight that we've got the River Management Symposium coming up in April, Mountain Creeks to Metro Canals. This is going to be held April 12th through the 15th and hosted virtually by RMS, the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and Virginia Commonwealth University. So we've got a lot of great themes around conservation, partnership development, new technology available to restore and monitor streams, wild and scenic rivers designation and management, and river access design for urban and rural rivers. So we've got early registration open through February 28th. If you register by then, you'll save $30 and members save an additional $30. So if you're not a member of RMS, it's a great time to join. And with that, I'd just like to say thanks again to today's presenters. This recording will be available on the RMS website, and in the description of the recording, we'll provide a copy of this PowerPoint in PDF format, and I'll also include a link to the handout again. So with that being said, thank you everyone for joining today, and we hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.